Hampshire, England, December 1815. The drawing-room at Langford Hall carried the chill of winter despite the fire crackling in the marble hearth, though perhaps the cold Lady Beatrice Langford felt had less to do with temperature than with the icy voices of her sisters discussing her fate as though she were not present. At 27, Lady Beatrice knew precisely what her family thought of her. 7 London seasons had come and gone without a single acceptable proposal, and now she lived as little more than a permanent guest in her eldest sister's home, enduring daily reminders of her failure with the practiced dignity of someone who had learned that silence was often the only defense against cruelty. The words her sister Philippa spoke to their visiting aunt carried across the room with deliberate clarity, sharp as the point of a lancet against bare skin. One would think after so many years, dear Beatrice might accept that spinsterhood is not merely her fate, but her natural state. It would relieve us of much inconvenience if she simply embraced it with grace, instead of this pathetic pretense of hope each winter. If stories of resilience and unexpected love touch your heart, subscribe now and join us on this journey. You will not want to miss what happens next. Perhaps, Aunt Cordelia replied with false sympathy that made Beatrice's fingers tighten imperceptibly on the embroidery hoop in her lap. We should consider finding her a position as companion to some elderly widow in Bath. At least then she might feel useful rather than burdensome. Beatrice kept her eyes fixed on the intricate pattern she was creating, each stitch precise and controlled, giving no indication that she heard every poisoned word. She had perfected this particular performance over years of such conversations. The invisible woman, present but not truly seen, listening but not acknowledged, existing in a strange limbo between family member and unwanted obligation. Her younger sister Caroline, married these past 3 years to a wealthy baronet, added her voice to the chorus with the casual cruelty of someone who had never known rejection. Mamma spoiled her dreadfully with all those books and intellectual pursuits. No gentleman wants a wife who reads philosophy and keeps opinions about politics. I warned her years ago that she would frighten away every suitable match with that unnatural cleverness. The embroidery needle slipped, pricking Beatrice's finger through her glove. A tiny spot of crimson stained the ivory silk, spreading slowly like all the small hurts she had absorbed over the years. She set the hoop aside carefully, rising to her feet with the unhurried grace that came from years of training to be the perfect lady, even if perfection had brought her nothing but this half-life of charitable tolerance. "If you will excuse me," Beatrice said quietly, her voice steady despite the familiar ache building in her chest. "I believe I shall take some air in the conservatory." No one responded. The conversation continued as though she had not spoken at all, as though she had already ceased to exist in any meaningful way. Beatrice walked from the drawing-room with her spine straight and her head high, clinging to the composure that was perhaps her only remaining source of pride. The conservatory offered blessed solitude and the sharp, clean scent of winter jasmine that climbed the glass walls in defiance of the season's harshness. Beatrice pressed her palm against the cold window pane, watching her breath form a soft white mist on the glass as she looked out over the snow-covered grounds of Langford Hall. The faint sound of the house's heavy silence seemed to press in on her here. Beyond the formal gardens, she could see the border of Ashfield Park, the neighbouring estate that had stood empty for years until last month, when its reclusive owner had finally returned from the wars. The Earl of Ashfield, she had heard whispered, though no one in the family had yet encountered him. The servants spoke of him in hushed tones, suggesting he was damaged in ways that went beyond physical scars, that he kept to himself in that vast, cold house with only a handful of staff and no visitors. Beatrice understood isolation. She had lived surrounded by family yet entirely alone for so many years that sometimes she wondered if she had already become a ghost, visible only when someone wished to acknowledge her failures. "They speak of you as though you are already dead." The voice came from directly behind her, low and rough as gravel, and Beatrice spun around with a gasp that echoed in the glass-enclosed space. A man stood in the doorway to the conservatory, tall and broad-shouldered, dressed in riding clothes that spoke of quality despite their severe simplicity. His face was striking rather than handsome, all sharp angles and hard planes, with eyes the color of winter storms that studied her with an intensity that made her heart race for reasons she could not immediately name. "Forgive me," he said, though his tone suggested he felt no particular need for forgiveness. "I did not mean to startle you. The housekeeper directed me here when I inquired after Lord Langford. I am Jonathan Gray, Earl of Ashfield, your neighbour, if I am not mistaken." Beatrice pressed a hand to her racing heart, struggling to regain the composure that had momentarily deserted her. "Lord Ashfield, I am Lady Beatrice Langford. My brother-in-law is from home today, but I expect him to return before dinner." "I did not come to see Lord Langford," Jonathan said, taking a step into the conservatory. "I came because I could not help but overhear voices from the drawing room as I passed. Voices speaking with remarkable cruelty about someone named Beatrice, who I assume is you." Heat flooded Beatrice's cheeks, mortification mixing with anger at this stranger's casual acknowledgement of her humiliation. "I do not require your pity, my lord." "Good," he replied with startling bluntness. "I am not offering any. What I am offering is considerably more practical and infinitely more satisfying." Beatrice studied him warily, noting the tension in his shoulders, the way his hands remained carefully at his sides, as though he did not quite trust them, the shadows that lingered in his eyes despite the directness of his gaze. This was a man who carried wounds, she realized, even if they were not visible to the unobservant eye. "You have my attention, my lord," she said carefully. Jonathan moved closer, his boots silent on the conservatory's stone floor, and when he spoke again, his voice held something that might have been respect. "I propose a bargain, Lady Beatrice, one that will prove mutually beneficial if you possess the courage I suspect lies beneath that remarkably effective mask of calm you wear." "And what, my lord, might this arrangement entail?" Beatrice asked, torn between curiosity and caution. "The Winter Assembly takes place in 2 weeks at the Bramley Assembly Rooms, does it not? An event attended by every family of consequence in Hampshire." Jonathan paused, his gaze never leaving her face. "I need you to act as my betrothed for those 2 weeks, culminating in a public appearance as my fiancé at the assembly. We shall spend a fortnight in concentrated artifice, and in return, you will have the satisfaction of watching everyone who has ever dismissed or humiliated you realize they were catastrophically wrong about your worth." Beatrice stared at him, certain she must have misheard. "You cannot be serious." "I am entirely serious," Jonathan replied. "I have my reasons for needing to appear settled and stable to society. You have your reasons for wanting to prove something to your family. We can help each other achieve our goals." "And after the assembly?" Beatrice asked, her mind racing with possibilities she scarcely dared to consider. Jonathan's expression hardened, his jaw tightening as he delivered the condition that would shape everything that followed. "After the assembly, we end the arrangement. This is a business transaction, Lady Beatrice, nothing more. We will spend these 2 weeks creating a convincing performance of courtship, but you must understand this clearly. There will be no genuine feelings involved. When the charade concludes, so do we. I need your word that you will not develop expectations beyond what I am offering." Something in the harsh finality of his words sent a chill through Beatrice that had nothing to do with the winter cold seeping through the conservatory glass. Here was a man building walls before any attack could come, protecting himself with rules and boundaries against some pain he clearly expected. "You have a very low opinion of my ability to command my own sentiments, Lord Ashfield," Beatrice said quietly. "I have a realistic understanding of what happens when people spend concentrated time together while pretending at romance," Jonathan replied. "The pretense has a way of becoming real, and I will not allow that to happen. I cannot." The last words came out rough, almost desperate, and Beatrice saw something flicker in his eyes that looked remarkably like fear. She should refuse. Any sensible woman would refuse such an arrangement, particularly one delivered with such harsh conditions. But Beatrice was tired of being sensible, tired of being invisible, tired of enduring daily humiliations in silence, while her life slipped away in this half-existence of charitable tolerance. "Very well," she heard herself say. "I accept your terms, Lord Ashfield. 2 weeks of pretense, ending definitively after the Winter Assembly. No feelings, no expectations beyond what we have explicitly agreed upon." Jonathan studied her face for a long moment, as though searching for cracks in her resolve. The sound of the wind rattling the glass provided the only accompaniment. Then he extended his hand. We begin tomorrow morning. I will call at 7 for a ride through the grounds. Betrothed couples take morning rides together. We must make this convincing." Beatrice placed her hand in his, feeling the strength in his grip even through both their gloves. "Until tomorrow then, my lord." "Jonathan," he corrected, "if we are to be betrothed, even falsely, you must use my given name, and I shall call you Beatrice." He left as abruptly as he had arrived, striding from the conservatory without looking back. Beatrice stood alone among the winter jasmine, her hand still tingling from his touch, and wondered what on earth she had just agreed to. Behind her, through the conservatory door, she could hear her sisters' voices still dissecting her failures. But for the first time in 7 years, Beatrice felt something unfamiliar stirring in her chest. Not hope, precisely. Hope was too dangerous, too likely to lead to disappointment. But perhaps something close to it. A sense that change was coming, whether she was ready or not. The next morning arrived bitter and bright, the winter sun turning the snow-covered grounds of Langford Hall into a landscape of blinding white. Beatrice stood in the entrance hall at precisely 7, dressed in her warmest riding habit of deep burgundy wool, watching through the tall windows as Jonathan Gray approached on a magnificent black stallion. Her sisters and aunt had still not risen, which meant Beatrice could leave without enduring their commentary. She had informed her brother-in-law of the arrangement the previous evening, watching his eyebrows climb toward his hairline as she explained that the Earl of Ashfield was courting her. Lord Edmund Langford had seemed too shocked to raise objections, which Beatrice counted as permission enough. Jonathan dismounted with fluid grace, handing his reins to a waiting groom before striding toward the house. He wore riding clothes of charcoal grey that made his storm-colored eyes seem even more intense. When his gaze found Beatrice through the window, something shifted in his expression, a softening so brief she might have imagined it. "Good morning," Jonathan said as she stepped out into the crisp morning air. "I brought Artemis for you. My stable master assures me she has a gentle temperament despite her spirit." The mare he indicated was a beautiful dappled grey with intelligent eyes that studied Beatrice with what seemed like approval. Beatrice moved to the horse's side, running a gloved hand along her neck. "She is lovely." "Can you ride?" Jonathan asked, the question blunt but not unkind. "I can," Beatrice replied. "My father believed all his daughters should be accomplished horsewomen. It is one of the few gifts he gave me that I still treasure." Jonathan helped her mount, his hands strong and steady at her waist, lifting her as though she weighed nothing at all. For a moment, seated on Artemis with Jonathan looking up at her, Beatrice felt something she had not experienced in years. She felt seen, truly seen, not as an object of pity or disappointment, but as a person worthy of notice. They rode out together, following the bridle path that wound through the snow-dusted grounds between Langford Hall and Ashfield Park. The morning was still enough that Beatrice could hear the crunch of snow beneath the horses' hooves, the occasional call of winter birds, the visible smoke of her breathing in the cold air. "Tell me about yourself," Jonathan said after they had ridden in silence for several minutes. "Not what your family says, what you would say if given the chance." Beatrice considered the question, unused to anyone caring about her answer. "I read," she said finally, "voraciously and indiscriminately. Philosophy, history, poetry, novels, everything I can acquire from the lending library in the village, or persuade my father to purchase for me when he is feeling generous." "What are you reading now?" Jonathan asked. "Lord Byron's latest," Beatrice replied, thoughtfully petting Artemis's mane, "though I confess I find myself uneasy with his work. It is brilliant, certainly, but there is something so intensely disordered in it that troubles my sense of propriety." "The darkness is what makes it honest," Jonathan said. "Byron understands that life is not the polite artifice we maintain in drawing rooms. It is messier and more painful and infinitely more complex than society wishes to acknowledge." Beatrice glanced at him, noting the tension in his shoulders, the way his hands gripped the reins perhaps more tightly than necessary. "You speak as one who has seen that darkness personally." "The peninsula," Jonathan said shortly. 4 years watching men die in ways no one should have to die. Coming home to find everything changed, or perhaps to find that I had changed, and everything else remained depressingly the same. They rode on in silence for a time, but it was a different quality of silence than before. Beatrice sensed that Jonathan had offered her something precious in that admission, a glimpse behind the walls he kept so carefully maintained. "Why did you truly make this arrangement?" Beatrice asked quietly. "You said you needed to appear settled and stable, but there is more to it than that." Jonathan's jaw tightened, and for a moment Beatrice thought he would not answer. Then he spoke, his voice rough with something that might have been shame. "There are rumors. Since my return, society whispers that the war damaged me in ways beyond the physical. They say I am unstable, possibly dangerous. A madman hiding in an empty house because I am unfit for civilized company." "And are these rumors founded in truth, my lord?" Beatrice asked, allowing her gaze to rest on his without judgment. "I have nightmares," Jonathan admitted. "Sometimes I wake not knowing where I am. There are moments when sounds or smells transport me back to battlefields I thought I had left behind. But I am not mad, Lady Beatrice. I am simply a man trying to find his way in a world that no longer makes sense to me." Beatrice felt something shift in her chest, a recognition of kinship she had not expected. "I understand," she said, feeling lost in a world that everyone else seems to navigate with ease, wondering if there is something fundamentally wrong with you that prevents you from fitting into the spaces carved out for people like us. Jonathan turned to look at her, his storm-grey eyes meeting hers with an intensity that made her breath catch. "You are utterly unlike the woman I had anticipated." "What did you expect?" Beatrice asked. "Someone broken," Jonathan said bluntly. "Someone desperate enough to accept any offer of escape. But you are not broken at all, are you? You are simply unseen, which is perhaps worse, because it means the world has overlooked something quite remarkable." Heat flooded Beatrice's cheeks at the unexpected compliment. She was not accustomed to praise, especially not delivered with such straightforward sincerity. "You do not know me well enough to make such assessments. Then I shall spend the next 2 weeks remedying that ignorance," Jonathan replied. "After all, betrothed couples should know something of each other beyond superficial details." They rode back to Langford Hall as the sun climbed higher, turning the snow-covered landscape into something almost painfully beautiful. When Jonathan helped Beatrice dismount, his hands lingered at her waist a moment longer than strictly necessary, and she found herself reluctant to step away from his warmth. "Tomorrow morning?" Jonathan asked. "Same time?" "I shall be ready," Beatrice replied. She watched him ride away toward Ashfield Park, her heart beating faster than the morning ride could account for. Already she realized, with a mixture of hope and fear, she was beginning to understand the danger in Jonathan's carefully stated rule. Spending time with someone who truly saw her, who spoke to her as an equal rather than a disappointment, who looked at her with something that might have been admiration in his winter storm eyes. This was dangerous indeed, and Beatrice was not at all certain she possessed the strength to keep her heart safely locked away for 2 full weeks. Inside Langford Hall, she found her sisters and aunt assembled in the breakfast room, their faces registering varying degrees of shock and suspicion when Beatrice entered still wearing her riding habit, her cheeks flushed from cold and exercise. "You were riding," Philippa said, the statement delivered as an accusation. "At this hour, alone." "Not alone," Beatrice replied, helping herself to tea with hands that trembled only slightly. "I was riding with the Earl of Ashfield. He called for me this morning." The silence that followed was profound. Caroline recovered first, her voice sharp with disbelief. "The Earl of Ashfield, the recluse who everyone says is half mad from the wars?" "He did not seem in the least mad to me," Beatrice said calmly, though her heart raced at this first test of their arrangement. "He was perfectly civil and entirely rational. In fact, he has asked to call upon me regularly. I believe he intends courtship." Aunt Cordelia's teacup rattled against its saucer. "Courtship? Beatrice, do not be absurd. Why would an earl pay attention to you after 7 failed seasons?" The casual cruelty of the question would have wounded Beatrice yesterday. Today, with the memory of Jonathan's words still warm in her mind, she met her aunt's gaze directly. Perhaps because some gentlemen value qualities beyond youth and conventional beauty. Perhaps because intelligence and character matter more than the superficial accomplishments that make for successful London seasons. She left the breakfast room before anyone could respond, climbing the stairs to her chamber with her spine straight and her head high. Behind her she heard the explosion of conversation, the shocked whispers, the speculation. Let them wonder, Beatrice thought. Let them question and doubt and scramble to understand how the family failure had suddenly become the object of an earl's attention. The morning rides became a daily ritual. Each dawn, Beatrice would dress in her riding habit and meet Jonathan at precisely 7, and they would ride through the winter landscape while the rest of Langford Hall still slept. They spoke of books and philosophy, of the war and its aftermath, of the complicated relationships with families who could not or would not understand them. Jonathan told her about Spain and Portugal, about the things he had witnessed that still haunted his dreams. He spoke of friends lost, of the strange guilt of surviving when so many had not, of returning to England to find that the world expected him to simply resume his life as though nothing had changed when everything had changed utterly. Beatrice shared her own experiences, the slow erosion of hope through 7 London seasons of being overlooked and dismissed, the casual cruelties of a family that saw her continued unmarried state as personal failure rather than circumstance. Earlier, she had confided in him the deep psychological injury of that neglect, the silent internal nightmares of endlessly walking through crowded ballrooms where she called out for help but produced no sound, utterly unseen. She spoke of the loneliness of living surrounded by people, yet feeling entirely alone, of learning to make herself small and quiet to avoid attention that brought only pain. 3 days into their arrangement, Jonathan invited Beatrice to visit Ashfield Park. The estate house stood imposing against the winter sky, grey stone and tall windows that reflected the snow-covered grounds. Inside, Beatrice found a home that felt frozen in time, beautiful but lifeless, as though waiting for someone to breathe warmth back into its elegant rooms. "No one has lived here properly for 5 years," Jonathan explained as they walked through the portrait gallery. "My mother died while I was in the peninsula. My father followed her 6 months later. I inherited while dodging French artillery, and when I finally came home I found this, a mausoleum masquerading as a house." "It could be lovely again," Beatrice said, studying the portraits of Jonathan's ancestors. "With attention and care, with life." "I would not know where to begin," Jonathan admitted. "I have no wife to manage such things, no family beyond distant cousins who have made it clear they want nothing to do with the potentially mad earl who might at any moment become violent or irrational." Beatrice turned to face him, struck by the raw vulnerability in his voice. "You are not mad, Jonathan. Wounded, yes. Struggling with memories that no one should have to carry, but not mad." Something in Jonathan's expression shifted, the careful walls dropping for just a moment. "How can you be so certain? You have known me barely a week." "Because I recognize pain when I see it," Beatrice replied. "And pain is not the same as madness. Pain can be survived, even if the scars remain." Jonathan moved closer, his storm-grey eyes searching her face as though trying to memorize every detail. "Beatrice," he said quietly, "I need to tell you something important about our arrangement." Beatrice's heart hammered against her ribs, some instinct warning her that whatever he was about to say would change everything. "Yes?" "I have become increasingly aware of my own folly," Jonathan admitted, his voice low. "When we ride together, when we talk, when I see you standing in my ancestral home bringing light to rooms that have been dark for so long, I am beginning to forget why I made that rule about no genuine feelings." Beatrice's breath caught. This was the danger they had both known was coming, the inevitable consequence of spending time together while playing at romance. "Jonathan, we agreed." "I know what we agreed," he said, frustration evident in his voice. "But knowing something intellectually and being able to control what the heart does are entirely different matters. Tell me honestly, Beatrice, are you feeling nothing? Is this still merely an arrangement to you?" Beatrice wanted to lie. She should lie, should protect herself and honor their agreement. But looking into Jonathan's eyes, she found she could not. "No," she whispered. "It stopped being merely an arrangement somewhere between the morning rides and the conversations in your library. I am terrified, Jonathan, because I know how this is supposed to end." Jonathan reached for her hand, his fingers twining with hers through their gloves. "Then perhaps we revise our ending. Perhaps we see where this leads instead of trying to control something that appears to have a will of its own. But your rule, Beatrice protested. "You said you could not allow genuine feelings." "I was a fool," Jonathan said bluntly. "A coward trying to protect himself from the possibility of loss by refusing to allow anything worth losing. But I am tired of being afraid, Beatrice. I am tired of living half a life in an empty house, hiding from the world because I might be damaged goods." Before Beatrice could respond, a voice called from the entrance hall, sharp with authority and dripping with disdain. "Lord Ashfield, I know you are here. Come out at once and face the consequences of your reprehensible behavior toward my niece." Beatrice recognized that voice. Aunt Cordelia, who had come to Ashfield Park with what sounded like reinforcements. Jonathan's expression hardened, his walls snapping back into place with almost audible force. "It seems your family has discovered our arrangement," he said quietly, "and they are not pleased." They walked together to the entrance hall where Aunt Cordelia stood flanked by Philippa and Caroline, all three women radiating righteous indignation. Behind them, Lord Edmund Langford looked uncomfortable, clearly dragged along against his will to witness this confrontation. "Aunt Cordelia," Beatrice said calmly, though her heart raced, "to what do we owe the pleasure of your visit?" "Do not play innocent with me, Beatrice," her aunt snapped. "We know about your scandalous behavior, unchaperoned morning rides, private visits to a bachelor's home. Have you lost your mind entirely? Or perhaps—" She turned her venomous gaze on Jonathan. "Lord Ashfield has taken advantage of your desperation to secure some twisted revenge on society by ruining the last shred of respectability our family possesses." "I would caution you about the accusations you make, madam," Jonathan said, his voice cold as winter stone, "particularly in my own home." "You have no right to any offense, sir," Philippa interjected. "Everyone knows you are unstable. You have been hiding here like a coward since your return, avoiding society because you are unfit for civilized company. What possible legitimate interest could you have in our sister, except to use her for some dark purpose?" Beatrice felt fury rise in her chest, hot and clean and liberating. For years she had endured her family's cruelty in silence, absorbing their casual dismissals and calculated wounds. But hearing them speak about Jonathan with such contempt, attacking him for vulnerabilities he had been brave enough to share with her, something inside her finally broke free. "Stop," Beatrice said, her voice ringing through the entrance hall with a force that shocked everyone present. "You will not speak to Lord Ashfield in such a manner, in his own home or in my presence." Aunt Cordelia stared at her as though she had suddenly sprouted a second head. "Beatrice, have you truly lost all sense? This man is dangerous." "This man," Beatrice said clearly, "is a decorated war hero who served his country with honor and courage, while you sat safely in your comfortable homes, criticizing those who risked everything for your continued security. He suffers from the consequences of that service, yes. He carries scars that are not visible to the general populace, certainly, but he is neither mad nor dangerous, and I will not tolerate you or anyone else suggesting otherwise." "You defend him because you are desperate," Caroline said with cruel pity. "You are 27 years old with no prospects, living on charity, and you have convinced yourself that this broken man represents some hope of escape. It is contemptible, Beatrice, even by your standards." "Perhaps I am desperate," Beatrice replied, her voice steady despite the tears threatening at the edges of her vision. "Perhaps 7 years of being told I am worthless, unworthy, unlovable has left me willing to grasp at any possibility of happiness. But Jonathan is not using me, nor am I using him. We are two people who understand what it means to be judged unfairly by those who claim to care about us, and we have found something precious in that shared understanding." Jonathan moved to stand beside Beatrice, his presence solid and reassuring at her shoulder. "Your niece has done nothing wrong," he said quietly. "Every interaction between us has been entirely proper. We have been chaperoned by servants, we have conducted ourselves with absolute propriety, and the only scandal here is the way you have treated her for years. I have witnessed the cruelty she endures daily, the casual dismissals and calculated wounds. It is despicable." "How dare you presume to judge us?" Philippa gasped. "We have housed her, fed her, given her a home when she failed to secure her own through marriage." "You have imprisoned her," Jonathan corrected. "You have used her as a convenient target for your own insecurities and disappointments. You have taken a remarkable woman and tried to convince her she is worthless because it makes you feel superior. Well, It ends now. Today. The entrance hall fell silent. Beatrice's heart hammered against her ribs as she waited to see what would happen next, how this confrontation would resolve itself. She had defended Jonathan, had finally spoken the truths she had kept locked away for years, and she felt simultaneously terrified and strangely free. Lord Edmund cleared his throat awkwardly, studying the intensity in Jonathan's eyes. Edmund had long been uncomfortable with the manner in which his wife and her aunt spoke of Beatrice. Perhaps we should return to Langford Hall and discuss this situation calmly. Clearly emotions are running high. There is nothing to discuss, Aunt Cordelia declared. Beatrice will return with us immediately and cease all contact with Lord Ashfield. This inappropriate association ends today. No, Beatrice said quietly. Her aunt's eyebrows climbed toward her hairline. Excuse me? I said no, Beatrice repeated, her voice growing stronger. I am 27 years old, Aunt Cordelia. I am not a child to be ordered about according to your whims. I will continue my acquaintance with Lord Ashfield, and if you cannot accept that, then perhaps I should find alternative accommodation. The threat was empty. Beatrice had no resources, no independent income, nowhere else to go. But in that moment, standing beside Jonathan in the entrance hall of Ashfield Park, she found she did not care. She was tired of being small, tired of being silent, tired of allowing others to dictate the terms of her existence. Beatrice, Jonathan said quietly, might I speak with you privately before your family departs? She followed him to the library, aware of her family's scandalized whispers following them but beyond caring. Once the door closed behind them, Jonathan turned to face her, his expression unreadable. You defended me, he said, against your own family. Why? Because they were wrong, Beatrice replied simply. Because I could not stand there and allow them to speak such cruel falsehoods about someone I have come to care for deeply. Beatrice, Jonathan said, his voice rough, when I made this arrangement, when I established that rule about no genuine feelings, I was trying to protect us both from inevitable disappointment. I did not believe I was capable of offering anyone what they deserved in a true relationship. I thought I was too damaged, too broken by the war to be anything except a burden. You are not broken, Beatrice insisted. You are wounded. There is a difference. You make me believe that might be true, Jonathan said. These past 10 days with you have shown me what my life could be if I had the courage to reach for it. You have brought light to this house, warmth to rooms that have been cold for so long. You have listened to my darkest memories without flinching. You have seen my vulnerabilities without judgment, and you have made me feel for the first time since I returned from the peninsula that perhaps I deserve happiness after all. Then take it, Beatrice whispered. Reach for it, Jonathan. We both deserve happiness. We both deserve to be seen and valued for who we truly are. Jonathan closed the distance between them, his hands coming up to frame her face with a tenderness that made tears spill down Beatrice's cheeks. I am going to make a complete disaster of our carefully planned ending, he said. I am going to ask you something I have no right to ask, and you should refuse because you deserve so much better than a damaged earl who wakes screaming from nightmares and sometimes cannot distinguish past from present. Ask me anyway, Beatrice said. Will you marry me? Jonathan asked. Not as part of an arrangement, not as pretense for society's benefit. Truly marry me, Beatrice. Be my wife, my partner. Help me breathe life back into this house and purpose back into my existence. Let me spend whatever years I have left proving to you that you are the most remarkable woman I have ever known. Beatrice's breath caught, her heart expanding with something too large to contain. This was not how their story was supposed to end. They had agreed on pretense, on separation after the winter assembly, on protecting themselves from precisely this moment. But standing in the library at Ashfield Park with Jonathan looking at her as though she held his entire future in her hands, Beatrice found she could not honor their original agreement. The relief of being truly seen outweighed every sensible caution. Yes, she whispered. Yes, I will marry you, Jonathan Gray. Not because I am desperate or lonely or seeking escape. Because in these past 10 days, You have shown me what it means to be truly seen, and I find I cannot imagine returning to invisibility now that I have experienced the alternative." Jonathan kissed her then, gentle and reverent, and Beatrice felt the last walls around her heart crumble into dust. When they finally broke apart, both of them breathing unsteadily, Beatrice noticed tears on Jonathan's face that matched her own. "We should tell your family," Jonathan said. "Officially announce our betrothal. Give them no room to interfere or create obstacles." "They will be furious," Beatrice warned. "They will say terrible things, make accusations, try to convince me I am making a horrible mistake." "Let them," Jonathan replied. "We know the truth. That is what matters." They returned to the entrance hall where Beatrice's family waited, clearly having heard raised voices from the library and imagining all sorts of scandalous scenarios. Aunt Cordelia's face was pinched with disapproval. Philippa looked triumphant as though she had already won some victory, and Caroline appeared bored with the entire situation. "We have an announcement," Jonathan said, his hand finding Beatrice's and holding it firmly. "Lady Beatrice has done me the extraordinary honor of accepting my proposal of marriage. We are formally betrothed, and we will make the announcement publicly at the Winter Assembly in 4 days' time." The resulting explosion of protest was immediate and cacophonous. Aunt Cordelia declared it impossible. Philippa insisted Beatrice was being manipulated. Caroline laughed as though the entire situation was an elaborate joke. Through it all, Lord Edmund remained silent, studying both Jonathan and Beatrice with thoughtful eyes. "Enough," he finally said, his voice cutting through the noise. "All of you, be silent." The women fell quiet, shocked by Edmund's rare display of authority. He turned to Beatrice, his expression unreadable. "Are you certain about this, Beatrice? Truly certain, because once this announcement is made, there will be no turning back without significant scandal." "I am certain," Beatrice replied, "more certain than I have been about anything in years." Edmund nodded slowly, then extended his hand to Jonathan. "Then I offer my blessing and congratulations. Lord Ashfield, I trust you will treat my sister-in-law with the respect and care she deserves." "I will guard her happiness with my life," Jonathan promised. "This is madness," Aunt Cordelia protested. "Edmund, you cannot seriously approve of this match." "Why not?" Edmund asked mildly. "Lord Ashfield is wealthy, titled, and demonstrably honorable. He treats Beatrice with genuine regard, which is more than can be said for how this family has treated her these past years. I see no reason to object." Beatrice felt gratitude flood through her. She had never been particularly close with Edmund, but in this moment he had given her something precious: validation, support, the message that someone in her family believed she deserved happiness. The next 4 days passed in a blur of preparation. Beatrice moved temporarily to Ashfield Park, at Jonathan's insistence, properly chaperoned by his elderly housekeeper, Mrs. Davies. Together they began the work of bringing life back to the great house, opening rooms that had been closed for years, discussing plans for renovations and improvements. Jonathan showed Beatrice the estate books, explaining the finances and properties he managed. He introduced her to his steward and his stable master, the few servants who had remained loyal during his years of isolation. He took her on long walks through the winter grounds, pointing out improvements he wanted to make, sharing his vision for Ashfield Park's future. In the evenings, they sat in the library reading aloud to each other, or simply talking about everything and nothing. Jonathan spoke more about the war, about specific battles and lost friends, and Beatrice listened without judgment or empty platitudes. They shared wounds that transcended the battlefield, he the loss of his peace, she the loss of her voice. "We are a match," Jonathan said one evening as they sat before the library fire. "Two people damaged in different ways, learning to heal together." "I like the sound of that," Beatrice replied. "Healing together. It suggests we do not have to be perfect or whole to deserve love. We simply have to be honest and present and willing to try." "You make it sound simple," Jonathan said. "It is simple," Beatrice countered. "Not easy, but simple. We see each other clearly, flaws and wounds and all. We choose each other anyway. We build something new from our broken pieces." The night before the winter assembly, Beatrice woke to sounds coming from Jonathan's chamber. Screaming, the crash of something breaking, Mrs. Davies's voice trying to calm him. Without thinking, Beatrice threw on her dressing gown and ran to his door. She found Jonathan standing in the middle of his room, chest heaving, eyes wild and unseeing. A water pitcher lay shattered on the floor, and blood dripped from his hand where he had apparently grabbed the broken pieces. "Jonathan," Beatrice said softly, "you are safe. You are at Ashfield Park. The war is over." He turned toward her voice but did not seem to recognize her. His body was tense, vibrating with residual terror. "They are coming," he said hoarsely. "The French cavalry. We have to hold the line. Where is Captain Morrison? Someone find Morrison." "Captain Morrison is not here," Beatrice said, moving slowly closer. "There is no cavalry, no battle. Look at me, Jonathan. Please look at me." Mrs. Davies stood frozen in the doorway, clearly terrified by Jonathan's state. But Beatrice felt no fear, only profound sadness for the pain he carried. She reached out slowly, carefully, placing her hand on his arm. "Come back to me," she whispered. "Follow my voice back to the present. You are safe, Jonathan. I promise you are safe." Something in her tone must have penetrated the nightmare's hold. Jonathan's eyes focused gradually, recognition dawning as he looked at Beatrice's face. "Beatrice, what are you doing here?" "You were having a nightmare," she said gently. "You hurt your hand. Let me see." He allowed her to examine the cuts, standing docile as a child while she cleaned and bandaged the wounds with supplies Mrs. Davies brought. When she finished, Jonathan sat heavily on the edge of his bed, his face grey with exhaustion and shame. "You see now why I tried to warn you away," he said quietly. "This is what life with me will be like. Nights interrupted by screaming, moments when I am not entirely present, the constant management of memories that will not stay buried. You deserve better than this, Beatrice." "I deserve to make my own choices about what I can handle," Beatrice replied firmly. She sat beside him on the bed, taking his bandaged hand in hers. "You had a nightmare, Jonathan. You did not hurt me or threaten me or do anything except relive trauma that was inflicted upon you through no fault of your own. That does not make you a monster. It makes you human." "How can you be so calm?" Jonathan asked. "You should be frightened. You should be running back to your chamber and reconsidering this entire arrangement." "I am calm because I understand something you apparently do not," Beatrice said, giving his hand a squeeze. "Happiness is not reserved for those living lives unblemished by suffering. True devotion is what we offer each other amidst life's shared burdens and difficult moments. You have nightmares. I have years of wounds from emotional cruelty. We are both broken in our ways, and we will help each other heal. That is what partnership means." Jonathan pulled her close, burying his face in her hair, and Beatrice felt his shoulders shake with silent tears. She held him through it, offering no empty reassurances, simply being present in his pain. Sometimes she was learning the greatest gift was not fixing someone's problems, but refusing to abandon them when the problems felt unfixable. When Jonathan finally calmed, he pulled back enough to look at her face. "I do not deserve you," he said. "Perhaps not," Beatrice replied with a small smile, "but you are getting me anyway. Tomorrow we announce our betrothal to all of Hampshire society, and there will be no escape for either of us." "I have no desire to escape," Jonathan said. "My only hope is to merit the generous gift you offer me." "Then simply love me," Beatrice said. "That is all I require. Love me as I am, see me truly, and let me do the same for you. Everything else we can figure out as we go." The winter assembly dawned cold and clear, the assembly rooms in Bramley decorated with evergreen boughs and candles that turned the space into something magical. Beatrice, dressed in a gown of midnight blue silk, a garment Jonathan had commissioned for her, far finer than anything she had owned during her 7 London seasons. When she descended the stairs at Ashfield Park, she found Jonathan waiting in the entrance hall, wearing formal evening attire that made him look every inch the aristocratic earl. He wore charcoal grey superfine, the severe lines of the coat lending him a powerful presence. But it was the expression on his face when he saw her that made Beatrice's breath catch. Wonder, admiration, Love so clear, it needed no words to express. "You are beautiful," Jonathan said simply. "Not that you were not before, but tonight you look like the remarkable woman you have always been, finally given the setting she deserves." They arrived at the assembly rooms to find the space packed with Hampshire's finest families. Beatrice saw her sisters near the refreshment tables, Aunt Cordelia holding court among the older ladies, various acquaintances from her 7 fruitless London seasons scattered throughout the room. Every face turned as she entered on Jonathan's arm, curiosity and speculation written clearly in their expressions. The whispers started immediately. Beatrice could not hear the specific words, but she could imagine them easily enough. The spinster and the madman. What a peculiar match. Desperation meeting instability. How long until it all falls apart? "Ignore them," Jonathan murmured. "Let them whisper. By the end of this evening, they will understand exactly how wrong they have been about both of us." The master of ceremonies announced the first dance, and Jonathan led Beatrice onto the floor. As the music began, Beatrice found herself transported by the simple pleasure of dancing with a partner who genuinely wanted her in his arms. Jonathan was an excellent dancer, guiding her through the steps with practiced ease, his hand warm at her waist. "Are you nervous?" he asked quietly. "Terrified," Beatrice admitted, "but also strangely excited. Is that normal?" "Perfectly normal," Jonathan replied. "We are about to scandalously announce to everyone who has ever dismissed or pitied us that we have found something they cannot take away. That is rather satisfying, is it not?" When the dance ended, Jonathan kept Beatrice's hand in his and led her to the center of the assembly room. He raised his hand for silence, and the crowd gradually quieted, all eyes turning toward them with avid curiosity. "Ladies and gentlemen," Jonathan said, his voice carrying clearly through the space, "I wish to make an announcement. Lady Beatrice Langford has honored me by accepting my proposal of marriage. We are formally and genuinely betrothed, and I wanted you all to know that I consider myself the most fortunate man in England to have won the regard of such an exceptional woman." The assembly room erupted in shocked murmurs. Beatrice saw her sisters' faces register disbelief, Aunt Cordelia's expression cycling through shock, outrage, and something that might have been grudging respect. But Jonathan was not finished. "Some of you have been unkind to Lady Beatrice over the years," he continued, his tone hardening. "You have dismissed her as past her prime, whispered about her failures, treated her as an object of pity rather than a person of value. I want to make something very clear. The failure was never hers, it was yours. You were all so focused on superficial qualities that you overlooked one of the most intelligent, courageous, compassionate women I have ever had the privilege to know." Beatrice felt tears prick her eyes, but she blinked them back, determined to stand tall beside Jonathan as he spoke these truths that had needed voicing for so long. "Similarly," Jonathan went on, "some of you have whispered about me since my return from the peninsula. You have called me mad, dangerous, unfit for society. Let me address those rumors directly. I am not mad. I carry scars from my service, yes. I have difficult moments, certainly, but I am no more broken than any man who has seen combat and survived to tell about it. Must we then, in our insularity, insist that men who face such horror should return to us entirely whole? Lady Beatrice, here, saw past the rumors and the fears." He turned to Beatrice, his storm-grey eyes soft with emotion. She looked at me and saw not a damaged earl to be pitied or avoided, but a person worth knowing. She has given me reason to hope again, to believe that happiness is possible even for those of us who have lost our way. I intend to spend the rest of my life proving worthy of that gift." Jonathan went down on one knee in the center of the assembly room, still holding Beatrice's hand, and the crowd gasped at the impropriety and romance of the gesture. "Beatrice," he said quietly, though his voice still carried through the stunned silence, "I know we have already agreed to marry, but I want to do this properly. Before all these witnesses, before God and society, I ask you formally, will you be my wife? Will you help me transform Ashfield Park from a mausoleum into a home? Will you let me spend whatever years I have left proving that you are the most remarkable woman I have ever known?" "Yes," Beatrice said, her voice strong, despite the tears now flowing freely down her cheeks. "Yes to all of it, Jonathan, today and always. The assembly room erupted in applause, and Jonathan rose to his feet, pulling Beatrice into an embrace that was probably scandalous by strict propriety standards, but felt perfect in every way that mattered. Around them, faces that had shown cruelty or pity now registered shock, envy, and in some cases shame. Philippa pushed through the crowd, her face flushed. "Beatrice, wait. I need to speak with you." Beatrice turned to face her eldest sister, prepared for one final attempt to challenge her resolution, but instead, Philippa's eyes were filled with tears. "I am sorry," Philippa said, the words seemingly torn from her. "I have been cruel to you for years, and I have no excuse except my own unhappiness. I married for duty rather than love, and watching you refuse to settle for less than you deserved made me feel as though you were judging my own choices. But you were braver than I was, and I should have celebrated that instead of trying to break your spirit." Beatrice stared at her sister, stunned by the admission. "Philippa, you do not have to forgive me," Philippa continued. "I do not deserve forgiveness. But I wanted you to know that I see now what I was too bitter to acknowledge before. You were never the failure, Beatrice. We all were, for treating you as though your worth could be measured by your marital status rather than your character." Other voices joined in, people Beatrice had known for years, offering awkward apologies or congratulations. Even Aunt Cordelia approached, her face tight with something that might have been embarrassment. "Well," her aunt said stiffly, "it seems I underestimated you, Beatrice, and perhaps I was too hasty in my judgments of Lord Ashfield as well. I wish you both happiness." It was not a genuine apology, but coming from Aunt Cordelia it was probably as close as Beatrice would ever receive. She accepted it with grace, then turned back to Jonathan, ready to leave behind the people who had caused her pain and step forward into the life they would build together. They married 3 weeks later in the chapel at Ashfield Park. It was a small ceremony, intimate and perfect, with only Edmund and his wife representing Beatrice's family. Her father had sent his blessing from London, but claimed ill health prevented his attendance. Beatrice suspected he was simply too embarrassed by his years of neglect to face her happiness directly. It did not matter. She had Jonathan. She had a future. She had finally found the place where she belonged. The weeks and months that followed their marriage brought challenges Beatrice had not fully anticipated. Jonathan's nightmares continued, sometimes leaving him shaken and distant for days afterward. He struggled with crowds and loud noises, preferring the quiet of Ashfield Park to London society. Some mornings he woke disoriented, taking minutes to remember where he was and why. But Beatrice learned to navigate these difficulties with patience and love. She established routines that helped ground Jonathan, created safe spaces where he could retreat when the world felt overwhelming, simply held him through the dark nights when past and present blurred together. In return, Jonathan slowly began to heal. He found purpose in managing the estate, making improvements that provided employment for local families. He started a program to help other veterans returning from the wars, offering them work and understanding from someone who shared their experiences. Gradually, Ashfield Park transformed from a cold monument to a living, breathing home filled with laughter and light. Beatrice discovered her own calling in the work with veterans. She organized support for their families, established a small school for their children, created a lending library stocked with books on agriculture and trades. The invisible woman who had spent 7 years being overlooked finally found herself seen, valued, essential. 3 years after their wedding, Beatrice stood in the renovated nursery at Ashfield Park, holding her second daughter, while her eldest played on the floor nearby. Jonathan appeared in the doorway, pausing to take in the domestic scene with an expression of such contentment that Beatrice felt her heart expand with love. "I was thinking," he said, coming to sit beside her, "about that first day in the conservatory, when I made you that ridiculous proposal. 2 weeks of pretense with no genuine feelings allowed." "You were a fool," Beatrice said fondly, "but a well-intentioned fool." "That was a disaster of judgment," Jonathan corrected. "Even if it was for entirely the wrong reasons. I thought I was protecting myself from disappointment. Instead, I walked directly into the greatest joy of my life." "We both found what we needed," Beatrice replied. "You gave me visibility when I had accepted being invisible. I gave you hope when you had resigned yourself to isolation. That seems rather elegant when you think about it." Their eldest daughter, Catherine, looked up from her toys. "Mama, tell the story again about how Papa asked you to pretend to be in love, but then you really fell in love anyway." Jonathan laughed, taking his daughter into his lap. "That is exactly what happened, little one. Your Papa tried to be very clever and controlled, but your Mama was cleverer still. She saw through all his careful walls and loved him anyway." "Not anyway," Beatrice corrected gently. "Not despite anything. Simply loved you as you were and helped you become who you were meant to be, just as you did for me." Later that evening, after the children were asleep and the house quiet, Beatrice and Jonathan walked through the portrait gallery where this particular phase of their story had begun. New portraits hung on the walls now, showing their small family, capturing the life they had built from their broken pieces. "Do you ever regret it?" Jonathan asked. "The years of difficulty while I learned to manage the nightmares and memories, the whispers that followed us during our first London season as a married couple, the challenges of living with someone who is not and may never be entirely whole?" "Never," Beatrice said firmly, "because whole is overrated. Whole suggests there is nothing left to discover, no room for growth, no challenges to overcome together. We are beautifully imperfect, Jonathan, and that is what makes our story real, rather than some fairy tale where love solves all problems instantly." "You make it sound almost romantic," Jonathan said with a smile. "The damaged earl and the overlooked spinster building something meaningful from nothing." "It is romantic," Beatrice insisted. "Perhaps not in the way society understands romance, with grand gestures and perfect courtships, but in the way that matters. Two people seeing each other clearly, choosing each other intentionally, building something that endures through difficulty rather than evaporating at the first challenge." Jonathan pulled her close, resting his chin on top of her head as they stood surrounded by portraits of his ancestors and paintings of their own growing family. "When I made you that proposal in the conservatory, I thought I was offering you a temporary escape from your family's cruelty. I had no idea I was actually offering myself a permanent escape from my own self-imposed prison." "We freed each other," Beatrice said. "That is the truth, simply put, about love. It is not about one person rescuing another. It is about two people deciding to be brave together, to face their demons as partners rather than victims." 5 years into their marriage, the winter assembly came around again. Jonathan and Beatrice attended now established fixtures of Hampshire society rather than objects of scandal and speculation. As they walked into the assembly rooms, Beatrice remembered that first night when Jonathan had made his public declaration, defending her against years of casual cruelty. "Do you ever miss it?" Jonathan asked quietly. "The drama and intensity of those early weeks when we were still pretending?" "Not for a moment," Beatrice replied, "because what we have now is so much better than pretense ever could be. We know each other completely, flaws and fears and failures included. We have built something real and lasting. That is worth more than any amount of dramatic passion." They danced together as they had 5 years ago, but this time there was no announcement to make, no scandal to create. This time they were simply a married couple enjoying an evening together, comfortable in their partnership, secure in their love. As the music swelled and Jonathan guided her through the familiar steps, Beatrice thought about the woman she had been 5 years ago. Invisible, resigned, convinced she was unworthy of love. That woman had been brave enough to accept an earl's shocking proposal, to defend him against her family's cruelty, to open her heart, despite every reason to protect it. And in return, that bravery had given her everything she never dared to dream she might have. A partner who saw her truly, a home where she belonged completely, a purpose that made her feel valuable. Children who would grow up knowing they were loved unconditionally. "Thank you," Beatrice whispered as the dance ended. "For what?" Jonathan asked. "For seeing me when I had accepted being invisible. For loving me when I thought I was unlovable. For being brave enough to break your own rule about no genuine feelings." "That rule," Jonathan said with a smile, "was the stupidest thing I ever said. Though I suppose I should be grateful for my own foolishness, since it led us here." They left the assembly rooms early, choosing the quiet intimacy of Ashfield Park over society's entertainments. As their carriage rolled through the winter darkness toward home, Beatrice reflected on the peculiar journey that had brought them together. A desperate proposal made in a conservatory. 2 weeks of pretending that became real almost immediately. A public declaration that shocked Hampshire society. Challenges and nightmares and healing that happened slowly, painfully, honestly. It was not the love story society would have written for either of them, but it was their story, built on truth rather than fantasy, on partnership rather than rescue, on mutual healing rather than one perfect person saving another. And as Beatrice settled against Jonathan's shoulder in the dark carriage, heading home to the children and life they had built together, she knew with absolute certainty that their imperfect, hard-won happiness was worth infinitely more than any perfect fairy tale could ever be. Some love stories begin with dramatic declarations and instant passion. Others begin quietly, built from shared understanding and mutual respect. Theirs had begun with a lie that became truth, a rule that was broken, a pretense that transformed into the most real thing either of them had ever known. The earl who commanded she act as his betrothed for 2 weeks had been right about one thing. The rule he established about no genuine feelings had destroyed them both, not in the way he feared, but in the most beautiful way possible. It had destroyed the walls they built, the fears they carried, the resignation they had accepted. And from that destruction, they had built something infinitely better. A real love, a real partnership, a real life worth living. And that, Beatrice thought, as Ashfield Park came into view with warm light glowing from its windows, was the only ending their story could have had. Not the one they planned, but the one they deserved. Thank you so much for staying with us until the end. If this story of unexpected love and hard-won happiness touched your heart, please like, subscribe, and share with someone who needs to hear it. Your support helps us continue creating stories of resilience, healing, and the transformative power of seeing and being seen.